All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. This is Publishing Your Research panel and discussion, and we're so pleased to be here with the Canadian Journal of Soil Science and also hosted by the Canadian Society of Soil Science. My name is Morgan Tunzelmann. I'm the Journal Development Specialist for the Canadian Journal of Soil Science, and my role involves supporting the journal and its team of volunteer editors in growing content through outreach to our community and also in promoting the journal's publisher, Canadian Science Publishing's role as an independent not-for-profit publisher. I've been with the CJSS for 3 years, and I also work on two other journals related to agricultural science, the Canadian Journal Animal Science and Canadian Journal Plant Science. And before joining Canadian Science Publishing, I had a home in books research publishing. So I've had a hand in publishing all kinds of research for about 12 years now. So the CJSS is led by two co-editors-in-chief, Dr. M. N. Naeth from the University of Alberta and Dr. Judith Naraneza from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And Dr. Naeth is with us today, along with Dillon Muldoon, graduate student representative for the CSSS, who will be moderating the Q&A. So Dr. Naeth and Dillon, would you like to briefly introduce yourselves for everyone today?
Sure, I can go ahead. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Naeth. I'm a professor of land reclamation at the University of Alberta. And as Morgan said, I'm one of the editors-in-chief for the Canadian Journal of Soil Science. I've been working as an editor or an associate editor, a reviewer for my whole career, and it's still a pretty exciting part of the work that I do. So great to join you today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dillon Muldoon. I'm a PhD candidate in the Environmental and Life Sciences program at Trent University, where I focus on soil microbial ecology. Excited to be here today and work with the Canadian Journal of Soil Science and Canadian Science Publishing to put on this webinar for graduate students and early career researchers to get a handle on publishing your research.
All right, thanks so much. So I'm going to start us off today with some general information about publishing, and then I'll pass things off to Dr. Naeth, who will share some insights on preparing and submitting your manuscripts and everything you want to know about the peer review process. We do also have a poll to get a sense of you and your experience with publishing scientific manuscripts. So the first question is about your career stage. Please select the option that best describes your stage. And then have you published in a peer-reviewed science journal? And if yes, please indicate your approximate number of publications. So this is just to get a sense of who is joining us today so that we can address the questions, so forth. We will, while you're answering this poll, we will move on. And I want to mention that the advice that we're giving today about publishing applies to multiple journals and research fields. So it is not CJSS specific, even if we do use some examples from CJSS. But we do want to share a bit about the Society's affiliated journal. So the CJSS was founded in 1921 and publishes in all areas of soil science. And we also welcome cross-disciplinary research. So as a number of you are probably well aware of, soil science intersects with many other fields, including land reclamation and ecology and urban land uses and so forth. And so we acknowledge that in the research that we choose to publish. It offers discounts for various society members. So the affiliated society members receive a discount, but also the other societies that are grouped within our agriculture portfolio. So if you are a member of the Canadian Weed Science Society, for example, the Canadian Society for Agronomy, Canadian Society for Horticultural Science, you can also benefit from that as well. The journal is published by Canadian Science Publishing, which is a not-for-profit. And what that means for you is that we, as a publisher, are governed by a board of advisors with expertise and interest in advancing the scholarly record and not by shareholders. So that makes it easier for us as a publisher to support editorial independence. And so editorial decisions for our journals are made by members of the journal's editorial boards. Our paper types, so we publish research articles and reviews, communications or short communications, and discussion reply. We also have a perspective article type, and the journal is interested in receiving expressions of interest for those who may be interested, early career researchers who are interested in publishing a perspective related to soil science, so a method, an advancement in the field, an issue related to the discipline that they would like to talk to their colleagues about. And so if you are interested in that, please be in touch with me and I can provide you details with that too. And we're a hybrid journal, so we're open access or subscription options are offered to our authors. So the poll tells us, please select the option that best describes your current career stage. So most people who are attending today are graduate students, wonderful. And we have a couple of postdoc researchers as well and one established researcher. Hello. And have you published in a peer-reviewed science journal? So we have about little under half say yes, and then a little over half say no, which is an excellent balance. So we'll be mindful of that definitely through the Q&A. And if there's anything that we bring up that is you're not sure about, feel free to drop a question into the chat or a comment, and we can go back and revisit that. So I'm just going to close this and we will move on. Okay, so before I present a few things, we wanted to open up the floor just briefly to for those of you who have published in a scholarly journal or have submitted your work to a journal. Was there something that you wished you knew ahead of time, something that you may have found to be confusing? So if you'd like to, feel free to comment in the chat box, or if you'd like to raise your hand too, please do. But we'll just see if anyone has any initial comments that we can address before we go on. So we have a comment from Alicia. Thank you that you need to provide reviewer suggestions. Yes, that sometimes does happen, although as Dr. Naeth can attest to, we also don't always use reviewer suggestions for every reviewer. We typically go with one. But yes, that you need to provide reviewer suggestions. And so that's something that you need to think about, or that you need to alternatively sometimes provide conflicts of interest would be something else to know. Anybody else? Okay, well, as we're moving through, if there's anything that you want to add to the discussion, please feel free. All right, so scientific publishing definitely, we understand, can be confusing, can be a little bit of an opaque process, a lot of jargon associated with it too, as you can see there. But nonetheless, as a graduate student, it is an important part of your graduate training. For some programs, it is a formal requirement. And a publication record provides evidence of your skills as a researcher for future supervisors or employers. Perhaps most importantly, sharing your hard-won results with others really broadens our collective knowledge, and that's part of the central reason for publishing at its most base level. It can help develop you as a scientist, prepare you to be more of a critical and logical thinker and a stronger writer. And certainly learning how to respond to feedback, to reviewer comments, is a skill in itself, and that can help prepare you for your thesis defense. And then there are the reasons, that I think everybody knows about. Publications can boost your chances in scholarship and fellowship and grant applications. And also, publishing puts you on the radar of editors seeking peer reviewers for other articles if you're at a stage in your career where that's something you might consider doing. Yeah, so our aims for this session today, we won't be able to cover everything, but we will. We want to help navigate choosing the right journal for your research, understand some trends and considerations in science journals publishing, avoid common pitfalls, and include key requirements when preparing a manuscript for submission, and prepare for and respond to the peer review process. All right, so choosing the right journals. We find often that, especially for people who may be a little bit newer to the publication process, that the tendency can be to be focused on prestige and metrics like the impact factor. And certainly these are factors that you will be considering as a researcher. But we like to raise the idea that what is sometimes more important when you are publishing is that you're considering the community of people around the journal, the editors, its contributors, and the readers. So you want to ask yourself, is my work appropriate for this journal? You want to read the scope and make sure that the topics that are covered are within the remit of your own research. Ideally, this is a journal that you're somewhat familiar with, that you've read a little bit before you decide to submit. So if not, you may want to go through some of the recently published articles and take a look at them, make sure that they are relevant to the type of work that you write and that you would include, that you would cite in your own work. You want to have a look at the author guidelines too, the article types and so forth, and look at the journal's editorial quality. So you're looking for appropriate expertise on the editorial board and that the peer review policy is transparent and listed. And you want to make sure when you are navigating around looking for this information that the journal or its publisher should have an active and professional website with most, if not all, of this information. So sometimes it's easier to find than others, but you do want to make sure that the website is legit, that it has contact information for the publisher or for the journal's editorial board, and so forth. Yeah. So this graph is from a 2020 PLOS One article by several communications and publishing scholars. And they surveyed a multidisciplinary group of academics on how they go about selecting a journal to publish in. And you can see, although prestige certainly is important, impact factor is important, yes. The top factor for a diversity of scholars with some experience in their field is that it has the readership that they want to reach. Because ultimately, being able to reach the right reader for your article is going to get it received and commented and shared and cited, which is, ultimately what you want. And you can also look for other factors, the advertised speed of publication, days to first decision, which is the average of the decision that was either made to accept the article or to reject it, and then the days from acceptance to publication, with the caveat that quality peer review can take some time. You want to look at what are my rights as an author. So you should be able to find on the journal website that there are copyright licensing details as per how the author copyright is preserved, and it should remain with the author, and any details on the right to reuse your publication. You want to look at that your article will be discoverable, so indexed in the appropriate databases for your field. For example, the Canadian Journal of Soil Science is indexed in a number of databases, including Scopus, BioOne, and Science Direct. And this means that it is being distributed out to all the places where research ends up in all the different academic libraries and government libraries and research databases and so forth. And then you can consider too, what are your values? Is it very important that you publish with a not-for-profit journal as opposed to a for-profit, or is it not so important? Is it important that the journal is affiliated or owned by a society? Usually that is a good indicator of the journal's quality, so it is something to consider. And then, is it very important to you that you publish your work open access, or are your resources such that that's not as much of a factor? So open access, and I know that, you may already be familiar with the term, but what does it actually mean? As expected, open access, we're referring to the practice of making research articles and scholarly publications freely available to the public without financial barriers. And you can see the little lock there. And when we talk about open access with regards to a scholarly article, we're talking about the license, which is a piece of metadata that is attached to the article, and it assigns the author the copyright, but it gives people, anyone, a free pass or license to access, to use, and to cite. And so there are various types of open access licenses that are given out by an agency called Creative Commons. And some allow access only, but you can't do anything more than that. Some allow reuse of the work so that you can, if you're dealing with a piece of creative work, you can splice it up and include it in your own work, so long as you give proper attribution to the source. Open access is one thing also to mention about open access is that we do have solid evidence that OA publications are cited more often, and that's simply because they just have wider reach. They're going out to the global research communities, which often doesn't have access to those library databases, and so they rely very heavily on open access material for their own research. Another consideration is if you are funded by the tri-agency, so NSERC or another one of the agencies, then it's likely that you may need to make sure that your article is either archived in a repository or that it is published in a journal that offers open access or open access on its website within 12 months. This policy is from 2015 and it is under review right now, so it may be changing in the next year or so, but you can see that the tri-agency open access policy is listed on the Government of Canada website there. And then also just a quick plug for Canadian science publishing journals that we are compliant with open access policies of research funding agencies, and that authors from member institutions of the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, so that includes most Canadian research institutions, receive a discount on their open access publishing. Also that we do support preprints and accepted manuscript versions online. So if your work is published as a preprint, you would outline it as such in the cover letter, but that does not preclude its publication in our journals. Of course, the world of open science, though, is much broader than just open access, and includes various practices that are meant to foster collaboration among scientists when they're doing their research. I will just touch on the one related to open data, because that is increasingly, as you publish your work, you may find that there is a requirement for your research data to be publicly linked and available within your article, or there's an option. So it's your choice. But we as a publisher, we do try to encourage it because it is a practice that speeds innovation and ensures reproducibility, which is another important reason for publishing your work, that you're hoping someone might want to reproduce it at some point. So publishing research data and data repositories aims to support the FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, as well as the CARE principles: collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. We're all about the acronyms over here. And just a quick question for the audience is, have you uploaded your data to a public repository? If so, maybe just drop the name in the chat. That would be interesting to know. And then I also want to touch on a big question that always comes up now that did not come up 2 years ago or 3 years ago. What about artificial intelligence, or AI? And we know, of course, that AI has impacted everything, almost everything that we're doing online in particular, and it has, really significant implications for research integrity and the role of peer review. And certainly there is a role for AI, we think, within publishing, but you have to walk a bit of a fine line when you are considering how you use AI and how you report that in your articles. So Canadian Science Publishing has developed an AI policy, and I will just briefly share that in the chat here. Okay. So the key points, and this is a policy that I think we are going to be revisiting over these coming years, because it is something that necessarily is a bit of a living document, right? And that has to be changing. But generally, the guidelines that we are offering, which are based on other industry guidelines, are that authors may use AI tools for writing assistance and language improvement. And they may also use tools to design or conduct research, automating data analysis, sometimes organizing citations. Anything that is AI has been involved in has to be described at submission. So writing assistance and language improvement, we're saying, should be described in the acknowledgements. The use of any tools related to AI in your research process has to be described in the methods. Another thing to be aware of with artificial intelligence is its propensity to hallucinate sources, which is a bit of a problem. So when you are producing anything or submitting anything, be aware that you're always responsible for the content of your sources, to make sure your reference list is complete and accurate, and also that they're describing the proper the citation matches its reference in the text. And you want to make sure that you may not use generative AI to create or alter illustrations or photos, including micrographs or radiographs, but it may be used to create figures based on original data. We strongly preclude, as it says in the yellow there, any uploading of articles published, unpublished, preprint, or whole and part to AI platforms. That's for two reasons. One is copyright. Don't have the author's permission to do that. And then the second reason, you also are teaching the AI the information that's contained within the text without the author's permission, which is an ethical breach there. So ultimately, at the end of the day, authors, as an author, you're responsible for ensuring the integrity and factual accuracy of your work, so with or without AI, and that's always the case. And then the final note is, we've received this question a few times. Do not list AI tools as authors. Your author needs to be conscious and aware of its own actions. Yes, which you would think we did not need to address that, but that has come up a couple of times. So yeah, that's basically, and there's a whole other conversation to be happening around potential uses of artificial intelligence within publishing. But we, as a publisher and consulting with others in the industry, we thought, well, it has benefits for opening up, second language users, for example, in improving their English. So we should allow a means to be able to do that, but with all these caveats that I just listed. All right. So that is my main part of the presentation, where I'm talking a little bit more of a bird's eye view of the process. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Naeth, and she's going to talk about what does a successful manuscript look like, and just going to walk us a little bit through the peer review process, and share some of the insights that she's gained over the years from reviewing and accepting and assessing a lot of different articles from various author groups. So Dr. Naeth, I will just turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I think all of you know that the scientific content, the technical content of your paper is critical. You have to have good science to be able to publish. But what I want to focus on are some of the more peripheral aspects of what makes a good manuscript. And maybe peripheral isn't so much the right word, but really some of the other things that we don't necessarily think about when we're writing a paper, and particularly as new authors or early career researchers. The author guidelines in any journal are critical that you follow. It really shows respect for the journal. It shows you're being a professional because you know what the journal wants, the journal needs, and you're actually following those instructions and those guidelines. Sometimes they're really long, and sometimes it's tempting to just skim through and look for the points or the parts that you're really interested in at the moment. But read the full author guidelines, because it's so obvious when they come to me as an editor-in-chief, and even to the associate editors that are assigned the manuscript when it comes to the journal, whether you paid attention to these things or not. And you don't want to annoy people who are reviewing your work. And so if they're looking at what you submitted and saying, oh, they didn't even pay attention, their abstract is 600 words and the journal says they want 250, etc. So we have a few points here for you to think about. And the manuscripts types, they differ by journal. So that's the first thing you should be looking for is, does my manuscript, a research article, a review, a short communication, or a perspective, does it fit with this journal? And it's kind of like you go through the list of things and say, okay, that makes sense. Now, often what happens, particularly when you're converting a thesis chapter to a journal article, is you look at the word count and you say, oh, they want the manuscript restricted to 3,000 words or 2,500 words, but I did a count and mine is 6,722 words, or, it's often double what the journal is asking for. So go through, and I know it's really hard when you're looking at the word count and you're thinking, but everything in this manuscript is so important. Everything in this thesis chapter is so important. But go through, think about the message, think about what the reader needs to know. And often there are comments, things that don't really need to be in that manuscript, but the length is pretty important. The structure and formatting, every journal has, not every, but a lot of journals have different formatting requirements. So look at what your journal is looking for. Again, it shows respect and professionalism when you're submitting your article. Guidelines on ethics reporting. Some journals want to know, have you submitted this manuscript elsewhere? Some want to know on the ethics associated if you were working with humans or you were working with animals, etc. So there's different ways of reporting it, and that's a very important part that you need to do. And then field-specific guidelines. For example, we'd all be really excited to discover a new species, fauna or flora species. Journals are excited about that too, and there are particular ways that they want you to be reporting it. So these are only a few of the things that we've picked out to talk about today, but read that full several pages of guidelines to the authors. And in there, you'll also find different components of the manuscript. Some journals want highlights. Some want applied applications for your research. And if you don't include that, it's very obvious to those you submit to that you really didn't read the author guidelines. So next, I want to talk about a cover letter. So when I first started publishing, I didn't think cover letters were very important. I thought you just send a nice, polite letter to the editor and you say, I am submitting this paper and I'd like it to be considered in the journal. But as I've become an associate editor and then an editor-in-chief over the years, I've really started to value the cover letter, and I really realize how effective and important it is, because that's my first communication with you as an author. And you're telling me, I have some exciting information here. I have some good science that I want to publish in your journal. And I want you to consider it. Because remember, the editor-in-chief or the editor of a journal is the first person that's going to see your manuscript when it's submitted. And so we make the initial decision as to whether it's going to go to an associate editor and whether it's going to go out for review. So just a few points that what do we want you to do in that letter? We don't want a 2 or 3 page letter. We want a nice, concise, well-written letter that tells us a little bit about your research and what kind of impact it will have on the readers of our journal. I want to know how you think your work is advancing the discipline. What's new about it? What's novel? And that's the first thing I say, oh, this sounds pretty interesting. And if you can address the readers of the journal and talk about why this topic might be interesting. Is it a new method? Is it a new species? Is it just a different way of doing work or adding to a body of literature that is really growing in the present time, or resurrecting a topic that we didn't think was current at the moment? So tell me about that. Definitely tell me if your manuscript has been submitted to a preprint server. Many journals have that option. I'd like to know if you've done that. And if you have any downloads or statistics, you could include them. Obviously, we have special issues and we have collections in the journal, and I can't tell you the number of times that I get a covering letter from someone who's submitting to a special issue or a collection, and there's no mention of it. Now, that does often come up in the submission process, but I also like to know that. And if you are submitting to a special issue or a collection, then tell me as the editor why your paper fits. What is your paper going to be contributing to that particular special issue? Which means you should have read that on the journal website. What is this collection about? Why is it important in the context of the work that you're doing today? You want to declare any ethics, conflicts of interest or compliance. This might be related to authorship. It might be related to the fact that your thesis is already published. We get that as a comment a lot from people when they're publishing the chapters from their thesis. They'll say, but my thesis is already published. Does that mean I cannot publish my chapters as manuscripts in a journal? And it definitely does not mean that at all, but it really helps me right at the beginning of the review process if you tell me this is a chapter from my thesis. And some of the co-authors were members of my supervisory committee, for example. You need to make a statement that just basically says this manuscript is not under consideration by another journal at this time. I have not submitted it anywhere else. Even though that's the process that should be followed, not everybody follows it. So it's nice to make that statement right in your covering letter to the editor so that we know you are aware that you should not be double submitting and that you're considerate in telling us that. And it's okay if your paper was rejected by another journal, that's fine. Maybe it just wasn't the best journal. Maybe there were things that needed to be done to the manuscript, which you have now done. So you can also tell us that, this has been rejected by another journal, or in cases, I actually have several cases where people have said, I submitted this paper a year ago. We did some extra work on it, or, I've worked on it over the last couple of months and I'm submitting it again. We will know if you have submitted before to our journal, but again, it's nice for full disclosure for you to tell us that. And I don't think I need to remind you, but obviously submitting to more than one journal or more than one publishing agency is an ethical violation. So of course we shouldn't be doing that. So that's the cover letter. And again, just keep in mind that that's my first introduction to you. So give me a good impression of you. Now, what about the abstract? So it's so easy to take the abstract from your thesis or your work and just kind of, chop it down to the required number of words. But the abstract may be one of the few parts of your paper that's actually read by not only people in the review process, but outside once the paper is published as well. So a good abstract is really critical, and take as much time writing that abstract, even if it's only a paragraph, even if it's only 200 or 250 words, and really tell us, what is this paper about? So obviously stating your hypothesis very clearly, very succinctly, make it direct, and don't put a whole bunch of string along things in a sentence because you're trying to avoid an extra word or an extra space or something to fit that character or word limit. So one subject per sentence. Tell us one thing in that sentence. Move on to the next. There's a lot of interest in thinking about whether you use a passive voice or whether you use an active voice. Some journals really still prefer the passive voice. And I often have reviewers, even in our journal, where we are happy to have the active voice, come and give a response to the author and say, you have to change everything to the passive voice because that's more scientific. But what we're looking for is for you to sound excited and tell us about your research in a clear and active way. You can use some of the online tools that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And most important, please follow the word count limit. Don't think that just because it says 250, well, 260 really isn't that different. Again, it's respect and it's professionalism for the journal that you're submitting to. Let somebody else read your abstract. Give it to your fellow students or your colleagues or your family members or significant others and say, if you read this abstract, would you be able to know what I did and why I did it and what the important results were that I found? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use lay language in that abstract, because a lot of journals have a lay language abstract and then a professional technical abstract. So you want it to be technically correct and you want to be using the right words, but people should still be able to read it and get a good sense of what that manuscript is all about. So how can you avoid rejection? There's certain things that we just wanted to bring to your attention, and I want to talk a little bit about the reasons that are often given for rejecting a manuscript. So it might just, and I'll just go in the order here, but no, I'm going to actually skip one because the second bullet here says not original or relevant. Today, in my experience, working with associate editors, working with reviewers as editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Soil Science, this is the most common reason that comes back as to why your paper was rejected. It's not original. There's no novel information. This does not expand our body of knowledge in that particular topic. And that's another reason, and why I bring that up is so very important, is put that in your letter to the editor. In your cover letter, tell me right away what is unique, what is novel about your work, because there's always going to be something novel about it, and that's what you need to push forward. So it might be considered that it's just too inconsequential, or there's so much work in this area published previously that the journal is not going to move forward with even a review, even before they actually send it out for external review. They may be telling you that. Interestingly, in my own field, there's so much work going on in particular areas associated to contaminant remediation that I've even seen some of our journals say we are no longer publishing topics on this particular area. So what is new, what is relevant, and bring that into play. It might just be out of scope. It might just be too narrow oriented, too niche oriented, or the opposite extreme, it might be too broad. And often what will happen in that case, if it's still a good piece of science, is we might come back to you and say, we're rejecting at this point, but we encourage you to revise and narrow the scope, or broaden the perspective, broaden the application, and then resubmit to us. And in case I forget to tell you that down the road, when you get a response back from the editor that says, we encourage you to resubmit if you can meet all the requirements that were brought forward by the reviewers and or the associate editor. And we really mean that. And sometimes I'll often, as editor, put a note in the comment to you if I'm rejecting it to say, there's some good stuff here, but it's just not a full paper. So we encourage you to turn that into a research note. Take that key information that's important and submit it in a different format. Another common, and I see this a lot, in fact, I'm seeing this a lot more as an editor in recent years, is that the methods are weak or flawed, or the results are unreliable. We often skim over methods as researchers, when I always read the methods first because I want to know that the methods are appropriate before I take into consideration your conclusions and your results. And so I'm finding associate editors and reviewers are coming back and saying the methods aren't clear, or I really don't know enough from these methods whether those data are reliable, whether those results are reliable. Your methods should be written in a way that another researcher can look at it and could duplicate that work if there was intent to do so, if they wanted to follow up on it. So tell us what equipment you use, tell us what materials you use, what times, etc. Like all of those details become really important. And I also find that sometimes the methods, when somebody thinks they have to cut back words because their manuscript is too long, oh, I'll just go in and I'll, shorten up the methods. That's not the place to be doing cutting. So keep those clear, keep those detailed. There may be a poor analysis of the data. Now, we all have different ideas of what statistical analyses to use to analyze our data. And it's not that there's one method or one perfect method to be using. So you'll often have reviewers come back and say, well, this analysis is not appropriate. It very well may be appropriate, but then when you respond to the reviewer comments, then you'll talk about that as to why it is appropriate. So even in your paper, you can indicate this is why I use this particular analysis, particularly if it might be a little bit different than the common approach to analysis. And always make sure one of the things before you submit your manuscript is look at your conclusions, look at your hypotheses, your what you were anticipating doing in the paper, look at your conclusions and say, do the data support the conclusions that I've made? We often get really good papers up to until the point where we read the conclusion. And then suddenly those conclusions are very broad to general, making interpretations that are not really applicable. Like you're really pushing the scope. There's a lot of scope creep there. So make sure that you're focusing on my data, and I'm confident with those conclusions for these reasons. The study often ignores potential interpretations of the data. And so when you're writing your discussion part of your manuscript, you want to be talking about, here's how I'm interpreting that data. Now, there's others who have or may interpret this data differently, and put that in, cite a reference. Speak about why you've made that potential interpretation and why you think that interpretation is appropriate. We often get, again, reviewers and associate editors coming back to me and saying, I can't even assess this paper. It's very poorly written. The flow isn't very logical. I can't do a good review, and I can't expect reviewers to be doing a good review. So it's not only if English is your second language or French is your second language and you're submitting in one of those languages to Canadian Journal of Soil Science, you just might not be as clear a writer as you think you are. So have somebody else, have your colleagues, if you're graduate students, and 88% of you here today are, then share this with your colleagues. Say, can you read this paper? And I'll read yours, and let's get some feedback on the paper before you ever submit it. And if you do have problems with the language that you're submitting in, and it's not your native language, then by all means have it reviewed or have somebody help you with that. And again, duplicate submission, I mentioned that before, but definitely we will find out. I just had 2 journal papers submissions that we rejected because, first of all, one person actually published almost a similar type paper in another journal and didn't tell us. We rejected it. So we will find out. So you're not going to get away with it. So just don't do it. And yeah, ask for feedback from not just your professor or your supervisor, but from your colleagues, because we're all looking at it with different eyes and different interpretations. So hopefully that'll help you to avoid rejection for at least some of these particular reasons. So you're ready to submit. I'm just going to go through a few slides here just to tell you a little bit about that. If you haven't, I think it was about 50%, maybe half of you have not submitted a manuscript, so this might be helpful to you. Different publishers have different methods, and Morgan has mentioned this, but there's always some kind of specific protocol that needs to be followed, and generally some kind of editorial management portal. So we use Scholar One. Canadian Science Publishing uses Scholar One, and then Scholar One links to each of the journal homepages. And one thing you might want to remember too, before you're submitting, read papers in that journal, read recent papers in that journal to give you a sense of, yes, this will be a good home for my particular submission. So you make an account and you follow the instructions. The instructions are actually pretty good in almost every platform that I've used or seen that are being used. So you enter the information, your title, your manuscript title, who your co-authors are. Some journals require that you indicate where your co-authors are from, what their positions are, etc. And this is all, you can follow it through. If you make a mistake, it'll tell you when you're trying to submit. It'll come back and say, oh, there's an error in this section. You need to go back and deal with it. Many journals require that you upload different parts of your manuscript in different places. So you might have everything all together. Some journals want you to put your abstract separately, etc., etc. And most of the times, figures and tables need to be uploaded separately. So if you have 10 figures, that would be 10 particular uploads. So again, if you're following that process in that portal, you'll do fine. They're pretty good at describing what you need to do. So this is just a little bit of a flow chart to show you what happens. So you submit the paper to the journal. It comes to me in CJSS, and I look at it. I read your beautiful cover letter that's telling me everything I need to know. And I'm thinking, well, this sounds like a pretty good paper for our journal. So then I submit it to, I pick an associate editor, and I choose an associate editor with an appropriate background to be able to assess your management or your manuscript. And then the associate editor, so there's a little box here that we could have added in there, but the associate editor will send it out for peer review. And usually we get at least 2 people for peer review. And then it goes through the peer review. It comes back to the associate editor. Maybe there's things that need to be done to it. But look at that little red box up on the upper left-hand corner, reject without review. So as an editor, I don't have to get feedback from an associate editor or from a peer reviewer. I can just reject it outright. And the reasons I would reject outright, some of those I have gone through already in the previous slides. So it may just not fit our journal. It may be so poorly written that I want you to clean it up before you send it back. Or maybe you didn't include some of the things that CJSS requires. But then once we get down, if you look at the bottom, after it goes through the full review process, the associate editor in CJSS makes a recommendation to me, and then I make the final decision. But if you look at that bottom row, that's what your associate editor is normally going to be doing. Might come back to me and just say reject the paper for these reasons, or accept the paper, it's a good paper, or maybe revise. And don't be surprised if you have more than one iteration of revision. So often you'll get a paper back and the reviewers and the associate editor will recommend major revision. So then you do the revision, then it comes back again and it says minor revision. Then it might come back again, a third time even, and it might say, there's just a few little things you still have to do. So don't get discouraged, just keep working through the process and making sure you're doing what's asked of you. So just a little bit more about peer review as we finish off my part here. So rigorous peer review is needed. One of the biggest problems we're having at journals, and not just our journals, not just CSP journals, I have a lot of colleagues that are editors and associate editors, and that is getting reviewers. We don't have enough reviewers. We sometimes have to ask 10 or 15 people to review before we ever get the 2 or 3 required ones. So different academic journals have different approaches to peer review, but it's rigorous, it's necessary. And the reason is because there are actually people out there who are not as honest as those of you on this webinar who are interested in publishing good quality research in an ethical way. But there's a lot of fraudulent practices. There's what we call paper mills, where people just basically make up data and write papers and submit them. There are people who are submitting to numerous journals. There's people who like they have flawed research, or the research and the results coming from that research just don't make any sense, etc. So we have to have good peer reviewers who can go through and make sure that this is a legitimate, ethical manuscript and that it meets all the requirements of the journal. Now, how we pick our peer reviewers, I'll just take a couple of minutes here. Morgan already talked about that a bit, but we want you to give us recommendations because you know who the other people out there are. And these should not be people that you have worked with or your supervisor has worked with. These should be, arm's length people that you're saying they know the topic area and they would be a good reviewer. So you're making that recommendation. We will probably pick one of those reviewers, but then the people who are doing the process of review, the associate editors, or even I myself get involved in this as editor from time to time, is we help find other people that have not been, their names have not been submitted. And yeah, so reviewer time and availability is a big issue. And there's also bias in peer review. Don't be surprised if you submit your journal article and one reviewer says reject and the other one says minor revisions, or one says major revisions and one says minor revisions. People have different perspectives. They have different biases in what they're looking for. And these may often be unintended biases as well. That, I think we have too many papers on this particular topic. So, I'm not even going to review it. And as we talk about, the title of this slide, the rigorous peer review is needed. I encourage every one of you, even as students, to start becoming reviewers. I met a colleague in the hallway the other day, and he was complaining about, I get asked to do these reviews all the time. And I said, how many papers did you publish this year? So he told me the number of papers, and I said, well, then you should be doing at least that number of reviews. I said, my practice is I review twice the number of papers that I publish myself. So if I publish 5 papers in a year, then I'm going to review at least 10 papers. And that's part of being the process of good publication and good science communication, is to make sure that we do our part as well. And so we are interested in having reviews by early career researchers, graduate students, etc., because you can do this. You've got good insight. You've got a good science background. And even talk to your supervisor if you're a graduate student and say, hey, I'd like to help out with a review sometime that you might be asked to do. And maybe that'll help with the problems we have of getting reviewers. So just a couple more things on reviewers. So if you look at this diagram that Morgan put together, we have author and we have peer reviewers. So you may have a single anonymized review process where viewers have access to the author information, but they are anonymous to the author and often, but not always, anonymous to the reviewer or to the readers. When you look at the double anonymized, you have the authors and reviewers are anonymous to each other. And then that information may be reinstated upon publication. And then we have the open process where reviewers have access to author information, peer reviewer information, etc. So we generally like to have anonymous reviewers. And I think when I look at all of the different processes, we don't want the reviewers or the authors to know who the reviewers are. But the more work that I do as an editor, the more I think it might actually be good for the reviewers and the editors not to know who the authors are. And especially when you're in small communities like soil science, for example, that maybe it's just better nobody knows anything about anybody associated with the review process or the authorship, and they're just doing that open or the review of that manuscript without having a bias, even an unintended bias of maybe, I don't think this person writes really good papers, so therefore I don't think this review is going to be as clean as we might like it. So that's my opinion and what I've seen in the last little while. I have periodically had reviewers say they would not review a paper from a particular author. And we also have an appropriate way for authors to indicate people or associate editors that they do not want to be reviewing because of possible bias. So, we can certainly talk about that later if that's important. So responding to peer review, this is my last slide, and this is as critical as the abstract and as critical as the cover letter to the editor. In fact, I would say it's even more important. Every reviewer wants to know that you looked at what they asked you to do. Every editor wants to know that you took the review process seriously and that you're actually looking at what we asked you to do. Most articles will require some revision. Read the comments really carefully, and I give you most important advice. Read everything, get upset, get annoyed, whatever you want to feel. Close that article and come back another day or later in the day and look at it more objectively. Because sometimes it's just hard after you've worked so long and so hard on a publication, and then it comes back and it's major reviews or it's rejected. Even the rejections you can really learn a lot from. So they're not personal attacks. And if we get some reviewers that have personal attacks, we would be dealing with that in the publication process. So all of those comments are there to improve your manuscript. When you're responding to the reviewers, thank the reviewers for their comments. Not every single point. If there's 20 points that you have to deal, you don't have to say, thank you for this awesome response, this awesome comment. This is really going to improve my manuscript. Make a comment at the top. We thank the editor and the reviewers. And then if there's something really specific that you think really helped you, you can make that comment as well. So do this point by point, nicely put together. Maybe you have the comments that you're working with in black, and then your responses are in blue, but address every single point. Include where the changes were made, where in the revised manuscript, the section number, the line numbers in the new document. And you have the option of not necessarily making a change. Maybe the reviewer is suggesting something that you don't agree with. Explain why and have a good technical reason why. Be polite, be professional. Keep in mind that this is just here to help you. And for example, I got a comment back on one of my papers where the reviewer just said, you have to go in and you have to change all of this, the number of times that you had a space between percent and the numeral, because that's not the way it's done. So my response was, well, I put a space between every numeral and every metric. So I'm just keeping it all consistent. So we'll see what the reviewer says. And one last point is you'll often have reviewers say, you missed several key papers that should be cited. So you can kind of think, is that the reviewer's papers that they want to be cited? Sometimes you get really good suggestions about papers you missed. Obviously include those. But if they're not relevant or they're not needed, there's no need for you to go through. But the important thing, every single point, respond to it, regardless of how trivial you think it is. So that's just from my perspective and the years in working in publishing as an editor, associate editor, some of the things I think you want to be thinking about. And I wish you all great success in your publishing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Naeth. It's so great to hear you talk about that. And with the reviewers who take the time to offer those really considerate insights are worth their weight in gold, because that's time, right? That they're taking out of their lives, and everybody's busy. So yeah, definitely very helpful. So this is very funny, because we were just talking about peer review, which is so in depth, and as Dr. Naeth mentioned, often there are several rounds of revision. But for the sake of this exercise, we're going to skip ahead and assume, okay, your article is accepted. And often by this point, because it is a bit of an arduous process, there is a sense, I think, among some authors, like, okay, my article's been accepted. That's great. I can get on to the next thing. But we will just mention that as a publisher, it's really helpful for us to see authors who are willing to kind of close out the loop and promote their own paper. And we do, we have social media accounts to promote our authors' work, but we find that the most impactful reach you're going to get is by promoting your own paper to your own network. And don't be shy. You've spent so much time working on it that you deserve to get those accolades. So just a little thing about CJSS and other journals as well is that when you get the acceptance notice, you get a line about that there are free access credits for the first few weeks after publication. So if you're not publishing open access, do use them. Like, do write a little email to your group and include them. And share your work on social media. It's always so great to see LinkedIn posts, and we do see them and share them. And then make sure your work is up to date on any academic profiles that you might have. So Google Scholar or ResearchGate. And then below there, I just got a little recent example. I was actually putting this slide together, and then I happened to go over to LinkedIn and saw that exact post. So it was a bit serendipitous. Yeah, and so we'll just, you'll be getting a copy of the slides. So we have a few additional resources for early career researchers. The first link is from a CSP journal called Facets, which is a journal affiliated with the Royal Society of Canada, and they put together a collection on early career research considerations. So we have a link to that. We have a link to Canadian Science Publishing put together a glossary around all the different terms related to open access, which is really handy if that's something that you are interested in. So there's a link there. And then there's a little bit on writing, the Stephen Hurd's book on the Scientist's Guide to Writing, an article from American Scientist, The Science of Scientific Writing, and then another book by Robert Day and Barbara Gastel, How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper, which is a real classic there. Yeah, so I think at this point, we will move into any questions, and I will pass it over to Dillon, who has been keeping an eye on the chat. And if you'd like to maybe, if people would like to share some questions in the Q&A box, and maybe in the meantime, we can go back and address any that have come up during the presentation.
Thanks, Morgan and Ann. That was a really great presentation. Really appreciate it. So one of the first ones that came up from Maythem was, can photos be edited using AI?
So I can take this one because it is in our AI policy. So our policy says no, and that's because it's related to altering the original creator's work. I can't speak for other journals or publishers, but that's the position that we've taken on it.
Awesome. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A or chat, or even raise your hand maybe, and you're more than welcome to ask aloud. I have a couple from me. So why would we submit a paper to a preprint server before we publish with the Canadian Journal of Soil Science?
Basically, to get feedback, Dillon, and I know it seems kind of interesting that you would be getting feedback while a manuscript is in review. But there may be things that are brought forward in maybe extreme scenarios. You might want to recall your paper and make some changes in the paper because you realize from these comments that you should do that. Doesn't happen very often, but often once your paper comes back for review, then you've got this additional set of comments rather than just the comments from the reviewer and the reviewers and the associate editors.
Amazing. Thanks, Sam.
And
Morgan, do you have
I can
anything?
just add to that. I think this was touched on, um, if there are if there are metrics, that is a plus definitely when it's being considered for the journal. If the
Ah,
editor
yes.
knows, yeah, that it's being accessed and that there's interest, that's a huge boost. So definitely it can be beneficial in some cases for sure.
Some another one I had that we kind of went over a little bit in, but how can we get involved in being a participant in the peer review process as graduate students? Maybe our names aren't out there as much in the journals yet, so are there ways that we connect possibly at conferences or any other kind of insights that you might have?
I think there's a lot of ways, Dylan, and thank you for asking that question. So, first of all, I think graduate students should talk to their supervisors. And because we assume all your supervisors are doing peer reviews, and just say, could I be involved? Your supervisor may be able to set that up in a formal way. Like if a supervisor came to me and said, my grad student Dylan is really interested in peer review. I'd like to work with him on this peer review. Would that be okay with you? And I'd be, yes, of course, that's a great idea. You can write to editors in chief of journals, and just say, I'm really interested. And we are actually at Canadian Journal of Soil Science right now. We just talked about this excuse me, in one of our recent meetings, that we'd like to set up a formal system whereby graduate students would be able to become peer reviewers and then get some guidance, some mentorship in doing so along the way. So I think you'll find that many journals are open, and many editors are open to having you just write us a letter and say, this is what I would like to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne. That's a great point. Morgan, do you have anything to add there?
No, thank you. That sounds great.
Sure. So another one we had here is during addressing reviewers' comments, should we mention the line of the new document in which some additions or revisions have been made, or should we mention the lines of the original document we uploaded on which revisions needed to be made?
The revised one, the new one. And
Uh,
often when you get reviewer comments that you've itemized and you're working on, the reviewers will say, line 131 to 134. So you would put that in that point, line 131 to line 34, and then here's what the reviewer said. And then your responses are below, and then you're saying line XXX in the revised version of the manuscript.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne. Uh, Another one here from Alyssa. So can preprint have the art? Sorry, can so you can preprint uh, and the article submitted to the journal, and it's not a conflict of interest. All good. That was my fault for reading. So, so I think would you be able to have your preprint on the server, and then also the question is, would you be able to have your preprint on the server and then also be able to submit it to the Canadian Journal of Soil Science, and that would not be submitting it in two places?
Right, because one is a preprint service, and you would be telling in your cover letter, you would be indicating that it's there. So full disclosure.
Awesome. And sorry, this is just a question on that from me. Is that the same for every journal, or is that Canadian Science Publishing's uh, kind of way to see that? Is could you yeah, here.
Yeah,
Can
that's
you
a good question. I'm not sure. I know that there are quite a few other journals that have the same policy, and the idea, broadly speaking, among the publishers is that we want your work to be read and we want it to be accessed by the community of expert researchers. So the preprints help facilitate that. So in that sense, that's fine because they are not peer-reviewed journals. They are preprint. I do not know if there are publishers or journals who have taken a stance where they say that if you've submitted to a preprint, you can't. And that would be an interesting question actually for our follow-up. So I will take that away as some homework.
And
Awesome.
from my experience as well, Morgan, I agree with you. I have not seen any particular journal specifically say that you can't do this.
Mhm. Yeah.
But good question.
Yeah. So as long as you're clear in your cover letter that it is on a preprint server, then it's totally acceptable to submit to the Journal of Canadian Soil Science.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just losing track of myself. So I thought I saw a comment there wondering about no, it's not no longer there. But when if you're using AI to help you clarify your writing as maybe your English is your second language, where would you acknowledge that AI? Obviously not in the authorship that we talked about, but how would you put that into your manuscript to say that you have used AI as maybe to help clarify your writing?
So our policy, it's pretty broad, admittedly, but it asks that authors describe the use in the acknowledgement. So they describe for what purpose it was used for in terms of the writing, and then also what tool was used. We don't have, and as of yet, our ethics department has opted not to include specific language, and that may just be because that policy is covering our whole journal portfolio, so it may be different from journal to journal. But as for now, that's kind of the specifications. Yeah, and that's actually another a homework maybe that we could provide is if I can find a good example of that text that would be appropriate. And I'll run it by you, Anne, but that would be
Yeah,
something that
sure.
would be helpful to show. Yeah.
I do know there are some journals, and I can't remember any names right at this point in time. It's irrelevant, but where in the submission process where you go through, you do the title, you do the authors, and there's all the steps of what you have to enter, is they do have a separate section where they ask yes or no, have you used AI? And if you say yes, then there's a box where they want you to put specifically how you used it.
Yeah, and that is probably something that we will be implementing in the future. But yeah,
Mm.
that would be, if I come across an example of that too, I'll have a look. Yeah,
I'll
thank you.
see if I can dig out the one that I'm referring to.
Awesome. Thanks. So Morgan, I saw you posted also the OPI for identifying contributors and co-authors. Would you be able to just tell us a little bit about what that is?
Sure, and
Or
we didn't have in some of our workshops we do get a little bit more into detail as per what the various contributor roles are, and that's something generally that for early career researchers is left. It's discussion with their supervisor, of course, who can give them the advice on that. But there is the credit taxonomy, which is the basically the gold standard for identifying what the various roles are. And then when you are submitting the manuscript and you're identifying um, which, which authors, which types of contributions they did, that's what you would be essentially using. So it's just another resource to be aware of. And maybe, Anne, if there's anything you want to add related to that.
Okay, I can't think of anything offhand right now.
Okay, yeah.
some. So if anybody else has any more comments they'd like to add into the chat, please feel free. Um, I don't know if Anne or Morgan, you have anything else you would want to add in terms of I'm drawing a blank here, sorry.
I have another comment I would like to make, and that is I really recognize, and thinking back from my own initial foray into publishing, getting my papers published, is it can seem like a really intimidating and really scary process. And I think the scariest part is waiting to get the response back as to what's happened with your journal. But once you have that first one, and regardless of whether it's good news or bad news, it definitely gets better after that. That we recognize you know, those of us that are telling you your paper is rejected, we're trying to do it in a way that it's being really helpful, not just totally saying this totally sucks, there's nothing good in it, but trying to tell you what was good, giving you a little bit of feedback. So when I said earlier, you can really learn from rejections, you can, and particularly when a journal, like the reviewers and the journal, make a point of giving you that kind of feedback. So my advice would be just do it. Just jump in there and do your first one and get that first rejection or major revision over with, and then you're on a good path.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks. So another one here was if we want to submit several journals, what can we do? So, yeah, Marnie, do you have a clarification on that? I'm a little unsure if we want to submit to several.
Well, you can submit to several journals, but not at the same time. So you can submit, and then if you get a rejection or you don't like the major revisions that are required or you don't agree with them, you can withdraw your paper and then you can submit again. So there's nobody says you can't resubmit or you can't submit as many times as you want to, just not at the same time.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne. I guess a question on that. So if you do get a rejection from the journal, and obviously as the editor, you said, is there like different sayings? So will you say, oh, please like change this and resubmit, or please resubmit? Or is there ever a time when you say, oh, I don't think this fits our journal, like please do not resubmit? Is that ever something that happens?
Oh,
Um,
all kinds of things happen, Dillon.
yeah,
So
sorry.
often if it's a really bad paper, we won't necessarily say this is a really bad paper. We will just say your paper is rejected without review because, like we usually give a reason because something related to the content or the way it's put together. I can't speak for other editors, but I myself will only invite a resubmission if I see good value in that manuscript and it just needs more work or it needs more information. And I will always be clear, like you have comments from the associate editor and from the reviewers, if you can meet all of those requirements. And sometimes even the reviewers and the associate editors don't give a lot of information. And they might just say like it's just not a good paper, rejecting. But if I go over it myself and I see value, I just recently I really liked what was in the paper, but it just wasn't a paper. It was almost like it was stretched too thin. So I went back and told the authors, if you can turn this into short communication and focus on your key results and this aspect of novelty, I would welcome a resubmission. So if I don't say anything about resubmitting, it doesn't mean you can't. It just means I'm not necessarily seeing enough value to suggest you should try to do that.
Okay. Awesome. So another question here. So we need to get a response first before submitting to another journal. And before submitting to another journal, do we need to revise the article to meet that journal's criteria? I'm thinking.
Well, there's kind of a couple of questions in there. So you don't have to wait for a response to get to submit to another journal. You can withdraw your paper. If you have second thoughts, I don't know why you would, but if you have second thoughts that, oh, maybe I shouldn't have submitted to that particular journal, I would really sooner submit here, then you can formally withdraw your paper and then you're free to submit it where you would like. Otherwise, you need to wait for the journal to tell you that your paper is rejected.
So I'm just clarifying for myself here too, Anne, is like so if the single manuscript, if it's submitted to the Canadian Journal of Soil Science, I can't submit it anywhere else until I either retract it or get an answer from the journal.
Yes, and that
Yeah,
answer has to be reject. Or
and
if
reject,
you,
yes.
yeah, or you just, I would really appreciate it if authors don't want to do the major revisions, if they let me know. Just say, thank you for the responses, but I'm withdrawing my paper. I'm not going to be resubmitting. I mean, otherwise we have a cutoff period where if we don't hear, I don't remember what that is, Morgan, but it's like, is it a couple of months or what is it that if we don't hear back on revisions, then we will start the process of terminating the paper.
I think it can be anywhere from 3 months and sometimes even longer, but just depends on the
Mm,
journal. Yeah.
okay.
But ideally, I mean, it's so much easier if we can just have that line of communication because otherwise we don't know what's going on, if you might have
Yeah.
been called away and you are intending to revise it, in which case we can make sure that it doesn't expire.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
that's such a good point, Morgan, because again, I've just dealt recently with some authors who have come back and said, we really want to work on these revisions and we will, but it's field season. I don't have time to do it now. Could I get an extension? Or even as they're working on the revisions that they come back to me and say, could I get an extension? Or the associate editor that they're working with. But yeah, the communication, I think, is the critical part. Tell us what you want to do. Sometimes I have authors that will respond back to me and say, um, I'm just not interested in, you didn't accept my paper right away, so I'm just not interested in doing anything. It's like, okay, good. I'm happy you told me that. And, now I know how to process it.
Exactly. Yeah, communication. And then if it is an author that you're seeing submit again, then you'll likely will
Yeah.
remember that you've had that interaction. So it's a good thing to do. Yeah.
Awesome. So I just maybe say, are there any last comments from either Anne or Morgan that they want to share? I know we are getting close to the end here.
Thank you to everybody who attended. It's a really exciting part of your career to be getting into publishing your papers and getting it out there, and we're just happy to be part of that process for you.
Yeah, and thank you so much to Dr. Naeth and Dillon and all the participants, and for your great questions. This has been a really good conversation, and we've covered quite a lot. So I hope this has been really helpful for you. Everybody who's registered will be receiving a copy of the slides, and we will also be sending you an email with a post webinar survey, so feedback. But I believe we're also going to ask for if you're interested in subsequent sessions, maybe getting into some of the finer details of one of these topics, we're going to ask, what you might be interested in. So do keep an eye out for that. And yeah, thank you everybody so much, and to the CSSS for being such a great co-host. Yes, and thank you. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.